Hello, welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Chris Conway. I'm the director of the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning here at St. John's University. I'm delighted to welcome Rabbi Michael Goldberg back to St. John's. Rabbi Goldberg was the second J. Phillips Chair in Jewish Studies here. And Michael, I hope this has felt like a bit of a homecoming for you. Before I offer a proper introduction, I'd like to say a few words of thanks. Thank you to Kathy Yanku and Catherine Rupp for coordinating Rabbi Goldberg's visit and for all your hard work behind the scenes and on the scene. Thank you to Dean Sean Kohlberg and the St. John's School of Theology and Seminary for co-hosting and co-sponsoring today and tomorrow's events. Thank you to Media Services who are here recording this afternoon's talk, and thank you to all of you who are here as well. Rabbi Michael Goldberg is a nationally acclaimed writer and speaker. He completed his undergraduate studies in philosophy at Yale, where he graduated Phi Beta Kappa. Following his ordination at the Jewish Theological Seminary, he received his PhD in systematic theology and philosophy of religion from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He has held 2 university chairs in Jewish studies here at St. John's and at the College of William and Mary. He has worked with the international strategic management consulting firm of McKinsey & Company. Yeah, I thought that's maybe what it was. Served as a professional ethicist with the Georgia Supreme Court, as well as with various hospital ethics committees, additionally providing support to gravely ill patients and their loved ones as an ICU and hospice chaplain. He is the author of several books, one of which, Jews and Christians Getting Our Stories Straight, was the subject of a feature article in the New York Times, and another of which, Why Should Jews Survive?, attracted front-page attention from the Washington Post Sunday Book Review section. Alongside his academic work, he has also written the novel Zeigler's Blessing. So if you study theology and philosophy and wondering what you can do with your degree, Rabbi Goldberg shows you can do a lot with that degree. His talk this afternoon, titled Different Stories, Different Genres, Different Gods, will draw not only upon his forthcoming book with Oxford University Press, The Bible's Gods, the Non-Existent One True God of Scripture, but his previous scholarship as well. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Michael Goldberg back to St. John's.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I want to begin by thanking all the people here at St. John's who've worked for over a year, patiently, tirelessly, and graciously to make my visit possible. From Dean Sean Kohlberg of the School of Theology to Director of the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning, Chris Conway, to the unstintingly diligent Kathy Yanku and her assistant, Chris Rupp, to Sister Helen Rolfson, OSF, who first talked with me about such a project. I also need to thank Aaron, as well as any of the other folks who helped set up this room for us today. To say that the Bible isn't a book, but a library, is a commonplace. Moreover, not all the books in that library are the same kind. Some, like Song of Songs, are essentially works of poetry. Others, such as Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, are basically primers for prudential wisdom. Still others, like the Pauline letters, are carefully constructed pieces of persuasive rhetoric aimed at strengthening faith and delineating doctrine for the early church. A large number of the Bible's books, however, are at bottom composed of narratives, from Genesis and Exodus to Joshua and Judges to Esther and Ruth to the Synoptic Gospels. Moreover, those storied accounts of Israel's God are reflected in non-narrative books like Psalms, with its narrative-based metaphors alluding to the deity as, for instance, shepherd and king. Many of these stories share a common goal: to tell not only of a character called God, but also to relate that God's character. Crucially, that God's characteristics as depicted by the stories are sometimes so contradictory as to be incommensurate portrayals of him. Some of you might remember that I analyzed conflicting stories about God in an earlier work of mine, Jews and Christians Getting Our Story Straight, the Passion and the Exodus and the Passion Resurrection. As Chris said, I'm carrying forward that methodology in my forthcoming book from Oxford University Press, The Bible's Gods, whose subtitle underscores what I'll be talking about today, the non-existent one and only God of Scripture. What I mean is that a close examination of the Bible's stories reveal different characters who share the deceptively simple English name God. And today, I'll talk about two such divine characters, the upshot of which will pose the question not whether God exists, but whether monotheism and monotheists can continue to exist. Bet that got your attention. To be clear, I am advocating neither for nor against the actual existence of either of the two characters called God, but only for a more perceptive understanding of the biblical narratives recounting those characters. Likewise, a teacher of classics may have the goal of getting her students to be more rigorously attentive to the very language of the text recounting the feats of a divine character called Zeus, regardless of whether she or they believe that Zeus exists. What I intend to do here is to highlight the conspicuously incommensurate characteristics of God as recounted in two pivotal stories that tell of them, and thus of him too. At the outset, I want to explain that I will use masculine pronouns in reference to the deity. First, since the Hebrew text does, and second, because the archaeological evidence attests to the fact that the Ugaritic god Elu was conceived of as a male deity, the self-same deity who was the origin of the Israelite god Elohim, about whom more shortly. I am not, however, claiming that God is male. The Bible never portrays God with genitalia. Indeed, as I learned from my former colleague and longtime friend, Sister Helen, in order to best emphasize God's radical otherness, we ought to pray to God in the gender we are not. For women, this move probably comes easily. They've been doing it all along. For men, it might be jarring, to which I say, good. No place in the Bible may serve as a better entry point for showing the value of a closer reading of its texts, for a truer depiction of its deities, than the seemingly familiar creation story related in Genesis's opening. What could appear to be more straightforward, more culturally ingrained in every English speaker, believer and non-believer alike, than Genesis's first verse? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And yet, the phrase, in the beginning, makes us go wrong from the start. Following such a reading stemming from the King James Version of the Bible, in addition to several other English versions, what purportedly makes God the supreme being is his act of creation ex nihilo, his creation of everything, of something, indeed everything, out of nothing. And moreover, his doing it at some 0 point in time, namely at the very onset of history. But although many standard English translations of Genesis' beginning verse may lead to that interpretation, it is nonetheless incorrect. As a host of translators, from the 11th century exegete Rashi to the modern editors of the New Jewish Publication Society's Holy Scriptures, NJPS for short, of which you have some copies, have shown the correct rendering of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, according to its Hebrew grammar, is markedly different. When God began to create, or at the beginning of God's creating. Genesis' first verse is thus a dependent clause, no declarative statement at all in a grammatical sense, much less any pronouncement about some temporal second at which the historical clock began ticking, and still less any assertion of God's creating everything or anything from nothing. Indeed, as pointed out by Abraham ibn Ezra, a medieval Jewish exegete known for his insistence upon a plain reading of the text, the Hebrew word for create, bara, is used uniquely in the Bible with reference to God's creative activity, but never with reference to God's creating something ex nihilo. In sum, failing to stay on track with the literal translation of Genesis' first verse means going off course and understanding the characterization of God, or as he is called in Hebrew throughout the story, the aforementioned Elohim. So what's a truer reading of Genesis' first verse? And here you might want to begin following along in the NJPS handout, from which, if need be, I'll occasionally diverge. Genesis 1, when God began to create heaven and earth. And Genesis 2, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. Just as no declarative sentence, let alone independent clause, constitute Genesis' first verse, neither does one comprise its second verse. Rather, verse 2 is a mere parenthetical phrase, but one nonetheless of tremendous significance for any who would still desire to use this opening passage to link God to some doctrine of creation ex nihilo. As the verse makes clear, primordial materials such as darkness and water already exist without their existence being ascribed to any prior divine action. According to the text's own depiction, one could not unreasonably infer that they had been created previously by other powers besides God. Moreover, up to this point, at the end of verse 2, God has actually created not everything, but nothing. If our reading is truer to the sense of the text, our earlier question about God's character remains. What makes this God, God? The next few verses of Genesis begin to provide some light, literally. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning, a first day. Only with Genesis' third verse do we at last get not only an independent clause, but with it a statement of what God creates first, light. Moreover, darkness is so much of a concrete substance rather than the mere absence of light that God needs to extract light from it in order for there to be something called day and for something else to be called night. But of course, since by the close of verse 5, nightfall has not yet returned to mark the end of day one, 24-hour days, as we talk about them, whether in common parlance or scientific terminology, are not referenced in any meaningful way by the text. At most, it speaks of daytime and nighttime. Furthermore, by naming these time periods, God acts as though these two now belong to him, much the same as this lecture is mine, because I have authored it and have given it its name as advertised, different stories, different genres, different gods. And as I develop my manuscript for this lecture, reviewing and approving each piece of it as I went, God similarly appears to have assessed his creation's first part, saying, as it were, in verse 4, so far, so good. But unlike the deity depicted thus far in Genesis, I do not have the ability to create something by merely saying, "let there be," using what the philosopher J.L. Austin called a speech act, where simply uttering something makes it so, like someone saying, "I pass," in a game of bridge, has that very effect. Most of my creative activity depends upon the acts of others, such as outside readers, as well as the teachers, colleagues, and other thinkers without whose work I'd never be in position to give this talk. So what kind of actor, what kind of character can it be who not only acts alone, but who has only to speak to decree something for it to come to pass? None other than a powerful sovereign, as the next verses continue to make clear. God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, that it may separate water from water." God made the expanse, and it separated the water which was below the expanse from the water which was above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning a second day. Acts of divine speech and separation accompanied the creation of sky, like that of life before it. The text, however, more broadly describes God's activity as making, in Hebrew, ya'as, perhaps because the root of the Hebrew word for expanse, lakia, means to hammer flat or shape. The narrative here literally views the sky, and not the KJV's lofty heavens, as a fabricated bowl that manages to keep the waters above it separate from those beneath its inverted basin. On day 2 of creation, something else differs as well. No divine approval, indeed no godly assessment of it whatsoever, accompanies the act. Perhaps this act is only a half step in the next full step of the overall project. In any case, we need to keep constantly aware that the text here is part of an at times ambiguous narrative rather than a theological discourse judged by its clarity and consistency. Accordingly, we need to follow the story through its various events to seek its overall meaning and whatever truth it may hold in store. So we continue in the text. God said, "Let the water below the sky be gathered into one area, that dry land may appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of waters he called seas, and God saw that this was good. The deity's creative activities return once more in the form of speech acts, and God said, and it was so. Moreover, those speech acts again entail an act of separation, more specifically of pooling the waters so that dry land might emerge. From such drainage, the ground, meaning soil or dirt or earth, but not the earth, forms. Strikingly, even though God might not have created water originally, he now has the power to command it. Most important, God views the stage of the enterprise, for which his previously separating water from water in hindsight seems to have been a preparatory phase, as good. And so the text continues, and God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, seed-bearing plants, fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, seed-bearing plants of every kind, trees of every kind, bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that this was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a third day. With the requisite elements now in place, the narrative moves to speak of what dry land and water can produce: plant life. God once more relies on speech acts of differentiation, this time between genus and species. Unlike earlier, God used the designation good twice on the same day. Why? Perhaps because the double affirmation serves to compensate for no evaluation on the preceding day, or else to mirror the creation of two complementary elements on the same day. We can only speculate. Again, This is not a discursive theological text, but a narrative one, as the next few verses will make abundantly clear. God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate day from night. They shall serve as signs for the set times, the days and the years. And they shall serve as lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to dominate the day, and the lesser light to dominate the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the earth, to dominate the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that this was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. With the recounting of the creation of heavenly bodies, the storied pattern recurs. God speaking, making, separating, affirming. Even so, differences from the prior narrative remain, some of them having small import, but others having enormous consequence. First, besides making or fashioning these heavenly bodies, which may or may not include what we call planets, God now places them in the sky as if he were stringing a Christmas tree's glittery balls. Notice that God does not name them, though, possibly because they function as mere instruments, ultimately in the service of two things that he has already named, day and night. Also left unanswered is the function of the stars. Most problematically, however, if the various heavenly luminaries have awaited their creation until day 4, how then to account for the creation of light on day 1, much less the separation of light and darkness, or of distinguishing day from night up to this point? Of course, later Jewish and Christian tradition have tried to answer that question, the former by equating such primordial light with Torah, while the latter, as you know, has identified it with Christ. While we might be troubled by such related issues as the length of each enumerated day, they could just as easily be 24 million years as 24 hours, they are of no concern to the text, which on its own terms, in terms of its language and literary moves, does not even try to address them, let alone reconcile them. In short, as a genre, this creation narrative belongs not to the category of history, but to that of myth, by which I and others do not mean a false story, but as the cross-cultural anthropologist Mircea Eliade put it in his book, The Myth of the Eternal Return, a story whose truth lies outside of time. On to creation's next phase. I feel like they say, let's go to the videotape. God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures and birds that fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." God created the great sea monsters and all the living things of every kind that creep, which the waters brought forth in swarms, and all the winged birds of every kind. And God saw that this was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fertile and increase, fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. After plant life comes the beginning of the creation of animate life. Indeed, its very description as nefesh chaya, as life that draws breath, distinguishes it from plant life. God's actions remain similar to what preceded this stage of creation, a speech act, a differentiation of species, and an affirmation of a robust enterprise that is growing all the time. Something new, though, arrives on the scene: blessing. But what precisely does it mean for God to bless this part of creation? According to the language of the text, blessing is clearly tied to fertility. Plant life has received no such blessing concerning fecundity. Inanimate, it lacks the means of fulfilling the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, an act that typically requires the kind of movement and motion during mating which only animate life can perform. Additionally, reproduction for much of animal life, even among many of the so-called lower animals, involves some kind of choice vis-a-vis accepting or rejecting a prospective mate. Within the context of the narrative, therefore, animals are capable not only of receiving a command from God that they are free to heed or disregard, these fauna are also the recipients of the first of all the deity's commands. Instructively, the story says nothing explicitly about death at this point. Failure to reproduce may conceivably lead to the extinction of a species due to its own inaction, but not as the result of some act of punishment by God. This text still has a little bit more to say, though, about animate life. God said, "Let the earth bring forth every kind of living creature, cattle, creeping things, and wild beasts of every kind." And it was so. God made wild beasts of every kind and cattle of every kind, and all kinds of creeping things of the earth. And God saw that this was good. With day 6, the creation of animate life, denoted once more by speech acts decreeing fabrication, differentiation, and affirmation, continues apace, with the advent of domesticable animals, cattle, insects and reptiles, creeping things, and wildlife. These life forms, though, all emanate from the ground, earth, rather than the waters mentioned a few verses earlier. Significantly, there is no trace of an evolutionary process here. Land animals do not evolve from amphibians or other creatures emerging from the sea. So for those attempting to find some reconciliation here between science and religion, this story about God provides little, if any, support. And here we come to another series of allegedly well-known and well-understood verses. And God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth." And God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created it. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fertile and increase and fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth." And God said, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. And to all the animals on land, to all the birds of the sky, and everything that creeps on earth, in which there is the breath of life, I give all the green plants for food." And it was so. Within these next few verses, a perplexing question arises. Just whom is God addressing when he says us and our? The prolific Harvard Bible scholar John Levinson answers that question by explaining that, quote, "an ancient solution to the conundrum of the first-person plurals remains the likeliest. As is the case in other passages in the Hebrew Bible, God is here depicted as a king addressing his cabinet, the other but fully subordinate members of the divine council," unquote. Ultimately, however, God remains firmly in control. Who else can say simply, "Let it be," followed by, "and it was so," except for a mighty, exalted sovereign whose action this creation myth recounts? Such a depiction of the deity illuminates the narrative's account of the capstone divine creation, human beings. Just as previously God has given life to species, so too he does now with the entire species of humankind, replete with both sexes, rather than, say, the Garden of Eden's lone male and female. Producing the species of humankind has apparently been the goal of God's creativity all along. For unlike the blessing and command given the fish and birds regarding fruitfulness, human beings are charged with mastering the earth and governing its other animate life. Against those who might take this appointment as carte blanche for the destruction of the earth's non-human creatures and environment, God's charge in context means the very opposite. For if humans are to be in God's image, to act like God, what is it that this story about God has displayed as its prevailing image of him other than a deity completely occupied, indeed preoccupied, with the project of bringing life to his creation? While the word selim in Hebrew refers to a plastic image or statue, which ancient rulers often erected to show their dominion over some territory, the word demut, meaning likeness, especially with the Hebrew prefix ki, meaning as, suggests that humans, to use Ian Barber's terminology, are not scale models of the deity, as a child's toy trains are to real trains, or as Greco-Roman deities were to humans, but that humans are analog models, resembling God in some noteworthy functional characteristic, namely that of giving life and overseeing life's continuation on earth. Hence, human beings, even though they may not be exactly like God, nevertheless resemble him when they not only bring new life into his dominion, but when they additionally serve as God's viceroys throughout his realm by preserving its good order, such that life is not diminished by humans or other animals, for example, killing one another for food. And now for the payoff. God saw all that he had made and found it very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. The final act of godly affirmation goes hand in hand with God's overview of his finished product. Very good. The overall project has gone true to plan and come to fruition. And now my reading is going to go off script a little by following that of the Greek Septuagint and the Syriac Pshita rather than the NJPS. The heaven and the earth were finished in all their array. On the sixth day, God finished the work he had been doing, and he had ceased by the seventh day from all the work that he had done. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because by then God had ceased from all the work of creation that he had done. Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created. Within the framework of the genre of myth, the seventh day, which happens outside of time, is particularly well suited to be a sacred time. No one-off, but blessed like animate life, so that it will be multiplied and thus recurrently observed for all time. Because no creative activity occurs on the seventh day, since God's creative activity had ended on the sixth day, the seventh day becomes ipso facto the first entity designated by God as holy or consecrated or set aside as special. In any case, the story which commenced with the phrase, "when God began to create," now concludes with another phrase that serves as its virtual bookend, "when they were created." So what makes God supreme according to this initial story about him and his character? Well, as we've seen, the narrative does not portray its deity as some kind of awesome wizard who, by producing everything out of nothing, ought to be envisaged as some sort of supernatural Lord Voldemort. Instead, what makes God lordly and majestic, as the text repeatedly emphasizes, are his decrees bringing order to chaos, and order not only very good for generating life, but for sustaining it as well. If Genesis' opening story, a myth, tells of a transcendent deity, completely in control, so powerful that his mere utterance becomes reality, another story in Genesis 32 belonging to a different genre, portrays a divine being who is anything but that. Although he goes by the same Hebrew name Elohim, he is by contrast so immanent as to be literally close at hand, having such limited power as to verge at times on powerlessness. His identity, though not his alone, is at the heart of the narrative which unfolds. While the earlier Genesis passages belong to a P source and these to an E source, we'll see that the differences between the one Elohim and the other run far deeper than that. Please turn to Genesis 32 in your handouts. Early in the morning, Laban kissed his sons and daughters and bade them goodbye. Then Laban left on his journey homeward. Jacob went on his way, and angels of God encountered him. When he saw them, Jacob said, "This is God's camp." So he named that place Mahanaim. As the story opens, Jacob, who'd earlier fled the potentially murderous rage of his duped brother Esau, is returning home after spending 14 years with his crafty uncle Laban. All along the way, he's met by God's angels, literally emissaries, whose presence portends protection. Significantly, however, Jacob names the place not Angels' Camp, but God's camp, foreshadowing another key actor in the narrative. Despite the appearance of the guardian angels, Jacob is terrified. He falls back on the wily ways that the Hebrew root of his name Yaakov suggests: usurper, or cheat, or more literally, heel. Certainly, English slang would depict him as having been a heel up to this point in his life. Among other things, he's deceived his blind, dying father Isaac, and thereby cheated Esau out of his bequest rightly due him as firstborn. To try and save himself from the approaching Esau and a retinue of 400 men, Jacob sends his own emissaries to bribe his twin. When that fails, the ever-scheming Jacob sends 4 successive groups ahead of him to gain his brother's favor. With his less valued maids, their children and livestock, along with the less loved wife, Leah, her children and their herds in the vanguard, and with his cherished wife, Rachel, her children and their animals bringing up the rear, night falls, and Jacob, having crossed the ford of the river Yabok, is left alone, unencumbered to beat a hasty retreat if need be. We continue with Genesis 32:25. And a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he wrenched Jacob's hip at its socket, so that the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." But he answered, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Said the other, "What's your name?" He replied, "Jacob." Said he, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with beings divine and human and have prevailed." Jacob asked, "Pray, tell me your name." But he said, "You must not ask my name." And he took leave of him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, meaning, "I have seen a divine being face to face, yet my life has been preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping on his hip. This is why the children of Israel to this day do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the socket of the hip, since Jacob's hip socket was wrenched at the thigh muscle. A mysterious, unnamed man, in Hebrew Ish, suddenly appears and engages Jacob in a desperate nighttime wrestling match, the goal of which is as mysterious as the man himself. Does winning mean that he kills Jacob, or will a simple cry of "uncle" by Jacob suffice? In any case, when the man realizes that he can't win any fair fight, he hits Jacob literally below the belt, wrenching Jacob's thigh at its socket. Even after this dirty move, though, the man still can't triumph and implores Jacob to let him go as daylight is about to break. Again, mystery enshrouds the scene. Why should daybreak matter? Is the man some sort of vampire, some sort of demon of the dark? All we have is Jacob's response. I will not let you go unless you bless me. It is, however, that response, that demand, through which the identity of the stranger becomes revealed. The blessing bestowed upon Jacob is a name change, which in the Hebrew Bible, as many of you know, indicates more than new nomenclature. More profoundly, it designates a new persona, a thoroughgoing character change. No longer will Jacob be Yaakov, the heel, needing to constantly scheme for a one-up against others. From now on, he'll be Yisrael, who's been successful in every struggle. But against whom exactly? Well, humans for one. But which ones? Esau, Laban, the mystery man? And against whom else? As NJPS would have it, beings divine. Yet the Hebrew Elohim is more commonly rendered as God by every other English translation, including NJPS itself throughout Genesis 1. Along similar lines, while NJPS says that Jacob calls the place Peniel because he has seen a divine being face to face, other English translations use the straightforward God. How then are we to decide? The literary frame of the episode provides the answer. A change of name, even a change of character, may be something devoutly to be wished, but it's not the blessing about which Jacob has been obsessed, namely that Abraham's, Isaac's, and his line will live on. It's that blessing's continued fulfillment which provides the prologue for Jacob's concerns about the long ago wronged Esau's revenge. When, in chapter 33, the newly transformed Jacob goes at the head of his division of sordid maids, wives, children, and animals, Esau greets him not with violent rage, but by simply inquiring in verse 5, "Who are these with you?" To which Jacob pointedly replies, "The children with whom God has favored your servant." In verse 8, Esau continues the family reunion by asking, "What do you mean by all this company which I have met?" Almost sheepishly, Jacob confesses, "To gain my Lord's favor." Now, instead of calling on his troops to exterminate Jacob and his offspring, Esau, in one of the most remarkable scenes of forgiveness in the whole Bible, which is often overlooked, magnanimously answers in the next verse, "I have enough, my brother. Let what you have remain yours." With Esau's concession, God's promise has been fulfilled. No wonder that Jacob exclaims in verse 10, "To see your face is like seeing the face of God," a phrase which alludes to the site of Jacob's nocturnal wrestling match, Peniel, God's face, and which thus also reveals the identity of Jacob's opponent. No angel, but God himself. So just what kind of story, what genre is this, and what are the implications not only for Jacob's character, but likewise for that of the God that it depicts? At its core, the account of Jacob's nighttime wrestling match bears all the literary hallmarks of a legend. Unlike myths typified by Genesis 1 through the beginning of Genesis 2 that occur outside of time and in which gods are the main actors, legends generally take place in a history-like setting and focus on the actions of an exemplary, often founding figure. The legend of George Washington and the cherry tree is one such example. Did it really happen? Most likely not. Was Washington completely honest throughout his life? He was like most other people. Again, the answer is most likely not. But the legend nevertheless serves to burnish his standing, his character as the father of his country. And what is the legend's implication, especially when told to small children? That they should try to be as honest as George, especially at those times when they, like George, have done something naughty. The legend of Jacob at the ford of the Yabok fulfills a similar function. As the literal father of the children of Israel, his character, transformed, ennobled, blessed, is equally significant, as is the event's attempted portrayal in a historical framework, replete with such actual geographical places as the Yabok and Peniel. Like the George Washington legend, this one too presents a model of emulation for future generations. Good Israelites don't eat thy sinews. In other words, no sirloin steaks for you. But perhaps most noteworthy in this episode is legendary rather than mythic, is that the main character is Jacob, not God. For Jacob is the richly delineated protagonist, not only with two distinct names, but also with a full-blown set of feelings and motives, while God is the antagonist, sketched so thinly as to have an ambiguous identity, prompting question about whether it's a man with whom Jacob wrestles, or an angelic divine being, or the deity himself. Whatever it is, it's not the God of Genesis 1. That divinity, as we have seen, is the Almighty, so absolutely free and powerful that his mere decree is sufficient to make things happen. The deity of Genesis 32, in stark contrast, isn't even powerful enough to wrest himself loose from Jacob's grasp, even after he's tried to free himself by striking Jacob with a low blow. In fact, this God is apparently so weak as to have to beg Jacob to let him go. Rather than the God of Genesis 1, who created daytime, we now have one who's fearful of daybreak. By comparison, it's Jacob who's totally in control, in command, saying, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So even though the deities in Genesis 1 and 32 go by the same Hebrew name, Elohim, that shared name nonetheless designates two different deities who share nothing in common. Starkly put, the deities recounted in these two chapters are two different gods, or more precisely, two different characters called God, who, though they might go by the same appellation, have wildly differing character traits. Failing to recognize that fact is like mistakenly thinking that everyone named Michael, or even Michael Goldberg, is one and the same person without any notable differences among these individuals. Just as it is with getting to distinguish one Michael from another and getting to really know this Michael from all others, so it is with those beings who go by the name God. Without paying close attention to the various stories told of them, it's impossible to know to whom we're referring. And here's the rub. If this talk has called attention to at least two different gods depicted in the Bible, how can monotheists continue to speak of a single God, let alone pray to him? The answer lies not with Scripture, but with tradition, which is the subject for a much longer discussion, not by individuals like me, but by communities of faith like both of ours. I thank you for your attention. And we have time for questions, Chris?
We do, yes.
Okay.
So there are microphones on both sides of the room, so please feel free to forward your questions.
So nobody here is a monotheist anymore? Is that persuasive? Yes.
Thank you for a wonderful close reading of this text. I had, some time ago noted the use of the first person plural in that first chapter, and wonder if one might account for that. Well, I think that makes another argument against monotheism. Or one might account for it historically, that the people whoever wrote the biblical text, lived in a time when there were many peoples with many different gods, and that they were reflecting in some way the culture of the time, but ours is the best.
Well, one way to understand that, and John Livingston extends that a little bit, but who else talks like, let us do this in our, but it's the royal we, right? And so there's that attempt to portray God's majesty. Without going too deep in the weeds here, if you've ever taken a biblical theology course or history of the Bible, you understand that there are gods from the north called Elohim and El, and then one who's the big one, who I didn't mention at all, but he's the God of the Garden of Eden story, Yahweh, who comes from the south. And eventually these deities over time, through historical circumstance and who wins and who writes, become merged into this one deity, the Yahweh El, the Lord God. But that takes centuries to do. And, we are so trained to read the Bible devotionally, like just, going down the page, rather than historically, side by side, this text with this, how does that say that, and this, that? And it becomes very, very difficult to be able to do. In Christianity, a Christian thinker who does that very well is Bart Ehrman. And I don't know if you've read any of his books, Misquoting Jesus, Interrupting Jesus Interrupted. I mean, he does that with the pictures of Jesus that get molded into one canon. Wow.
I just want to echo Rabbi Goldberg. What a delightful masterclass in reading the text closely you've offered us. This is just fascinating to read, especially Genesis 32, and the way that you offer is so enlightening. I would like to ask just maybe two questions if I can. One of those is, I think that there's maybe a way in which we can talk even about ourselves as having disparate identities. The infant that I was not the same as the 7-year-old who read a book about Marian apparitions and got interested in theology, or the teenager who decided not to become a priest because he was too interested in girls, or the 24-year-old who got engaged to a really amazing woman, right? In some ways, those are very different people. And yet there's a way in which I think, based on my sense of self and other sort of folks who've been in communion with me, they're like, well, yeah, but you're still the same Michael. There's still something there to you. I wonder, too, if that might also be kind of an invitation to us in the Hebrew Bible to recognize these very disparate portraits of God, or as you rightly say, even to the point where we could say that they're different gods, but the continuing relationship between the community and these figures traces perhaps a sense of identity that otherwise might not be noticeable.
There's a lovely prayer, a midrash, about Jewish prayer said 3 times a day in the standing prayer called the Amidah. And at the beginning it says, blessed are you, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, and also in some synagogues, God of Sarah, God of Rebekah, God of Rachel and Leah. And why does the text repeat those words? And the Midrash answers, because Abraham's experience of God was different than Isaac's, different from Jacob's.
Yeah.
And so, reading these texts, it's ways of encountering God rather than hearing these droning versions of these verses over and over, and that just deaden them. I mean, Esau in Jewish tradition comes out always the bad guy. Mm-hmm. He's always the bad guy. And yet, you read the story about the reconciliation with Jacob, and it's the most heartwarming piece of forgiveness that you can read in the Bible. I have everything. Let you keep what's yours. I mean, how many relatives do that? Yeah. So, thank you.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
I wonder, too, how these different portraits of gods in the Hebrew Bible might still have sort of a difference from the relationship with other Near Eastern gods. And here I'm thinking of Genesis 1, which seems in some ways, if biblical scholars are right in dating it to a post-exilic composition, right? Of perhaps being in conversation with the Enuma Elish, which has a similar ordering, also ends with a feast, but portrays a very different story of a god's power in council, the rivalry between gods, the violence of gods, versus the God portrayed in Genesis 1. So I was just wondering if you'd considered the ways in which, even though there are disparate portraits of God that we find in the Bible, if nevertheless there's still maybe something that's distinctive about the way that the community sees these gods.
Nowadays, scholars are very hesitant to compare and contrast ancient Israelite religion with the religions around them. Because in the past, that's always been, the Israelite religion was better and these were more primitive, and scholars don't want to do. There's a book, if you have trouble getting to sleep at night, I will recommend a book for you by Theodore Lewis. It's called The Origin and Character of God, and it's 700 pages of text and then 300 pages of footnotes. And it has pictures, the archaeological. But so Lewis points this out, they don't like to do compare and contrast. But one of the things that's notable about this version versus the Enuma Elish is, unlike lots of creation myths, God does not do anything by an act of violence. The world is not created by violence. And some people think that the reason that the peace sources in the exile picked Enuma Elish as their model was it was sort of the best science that they had at the time. And so these people were not primitives, the priests were the most educated people, they passed on traditions. But the thing also for people who want to say, well, okay, they use that as science, we can use the Big Bang as science. Okay, but as what you have to do is to have at the end of that, and it was good. And that is not a scientific judgment. That's a theological or moral judgment. And so it drives me crazy, people trying to reconcile science and religion in ways that don't fit. And there's some pretty famous people who attempt to do that, and it just is unconvincing.
Thank you so much. Very helpful.
Thank you. Yes, sister. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm wondering if the faith tradition that was behind both the editing and the reduction of what we have in Genesis chapter 1 and in Genesis chapter 2, if this faith tradition was thinking of two different gods.
I think that what happened was these things started orally with people who may not have been in contact with one another, because Genesis 2 following is a Yahwistic tradition from the south, And Genesis 1 tends to be more of a P or E from the north. And I think that people who put those together, and you can see this with commentaries, even medieval ones, how does this go with that, and so forth. People tried to bridge it, but if you read them closely, they don't work because the order of creation in Genesis 2 is the opposite. Human beings get created, and then water comes and plants and so forth. So what I think is terribly important with Genesis 1 is that people realize that God creates a species called human beings and not a man and a woman. And because if you start with that idea, that there's a single man, single woman, this is the question that I always had for my Sunday school teachers, that they would sort of push me. So I said, so who did Adam and Eve's children marry? And they couldn't answer. Now we know if it's a species, there are plenty of available mates. So, does that answer your question, sister?
Yeah, thank you very much. The second question is this. The light of the first day, it's singular. The light of this fourth day, I'm sure they are luminaries.
Right.
Yeah, so what's the relationship between this light of the first day and the light of the fourth day? Knowing that light in the Old Testament is also a metaphor for so many things.
Yes.
Like salvation.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I think that the text just doesn't even think that there's a problem with that, right? That there is this just general light, not emanating from the sun or emanating from the moon, but that there's this light that God extracts from darkness, just pulls out and wrenches it free, and then, okay, now we've got that. How do we started to talk about the creation of the seas and the waters and the heavens? I mean, the idea that that's an inverted bowl, that the heavens, that sky is an inverted bowl, it's like a physics experiment for the displacement of water. That I think it's more concerned with that stuff rather than how that first day light interacts with the light of the fourth day. I just don't even think that was a concern for them. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any other biblical evidence that that the man that Jacob wrestled was God? It couldn't have been an angel or a messenger of some sort? Or why do we fully believe it as a second God?
One of the reasons that the NJPS translates that as divine being instead of God, because there's such hesitancy about anthropomorphizing God. You can't see God face to face. Maybe you can see an angel or somebody that looks like a human being that's an angel, but maybe it's God. And this happens all through Genesis. And the other thing, God sightings and God hearings were potentially lethal. So that when Jacob says, I've seen God face to face and lived, I mean, yeah, seeing God could kill you. I mean, the closest you get to that is Moses, and I don't want to be vulgar here or upset anybody, but Moses wants, a vision of God, and God says, I'll put you behind a rock to shield him. And the text is in Exodus, and Moses saw God's backside. Like God mooned Moses, and the text just wants to avoid the idea that normal people can see God. Again, because it was thought to be very, very dangerous. Because one of the things, this gets into it with Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is really against images strongly. You have an aniconic God. So a God who's known only by his name and his word. So how do you represent God for Deuteronomy? And this is true in places like Ezekiel as well. God is seen as a radiance, not exactly a fire, like the burning bush, but the radiance that comes off of that, which you can't quite capture. And if you get too close to, you will get burned to death. And that's how Deuteronomy tries to portray it. Anyone else?
Yes, thank you. This is so interesting. It makes me think about something else you may be covering in your book, and that is the warrior God, the violent God. That's always the God that I've had the biggest problem with. So if you could speak to that.
Sure. So the root of the word El or Elohim is power. And Elohim is sort of like power of powers. To call a God holy is by definition to call a God powerful. And one of the ways that a God is powerful is by defeating the enemies of those whom he loves and is faithful. And even if you think about it this way, Jesus on the cross, redemption is there, but only first through an act of violence, extreme violence, crucifixion, and the power of God is to overcome that. And so nobody wants a God who's less powerful than they are. And why in the world would you pray to a deity who doesn't have as much power as you do? So the word God in Hebrew is synonymous with power, and a holy God is by definition powerful. And it's that fear and trembling, you know? You're drawn to it, you're fascinated, but not too much. That's a good question, thank you. Anyone else? Fabian, did you have a question?
Considering the emphasis on separation and naming in verses 3 through 10, separating light from darkness, what is above from what is below, naming day, night, sky, and seas, what biblical view of God's authority and relationship can we, I guess, see from language, identity, and creation?
I mean, in Hebrew, the word mavdil, which is the word for separate, that occurs, it has more of a sense of distinguishing. And the way we get distinguished most easily is by the name that we're given. That is our essential distinction. So naming is huge in the Bible. And I mean, it's no accident that, in the Gospels, naming of this child plays an important role right at the beginning, you know? And Immanuel, God with us, but more basically, power with us. Good question, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Why does Jacob ask for a blessing from an adversary, from someone he's been fighting with all night? I mean, is this reflecting back on Esau being his adversary, or why would he ask for a blessing?
He may have a sense, we don't know. He may have a sense that this is more than just a man that he's fighting with. And as long as you've got a divine being, whoever it is, you might as well get what you can, which is not $100, but a blessing. But that's an excellent question. All these questions have been very good. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Well, Chris, thank you all for coming. I really...
Thank you, Michael, for that excellent talk and giving us much to think about. As you are walking out, we have a couple more events scheduled for the J. Phillips Center this spring semester. In 2 weeks, so 2 weeks from today, we'll have a talk from Dr. Ori Soltz on Hizmet movement. I have the details here. His talk exploring Hizmet values. What can a movement rooted in Islamic values teach us about service, dialogue, and building bridges across faith and culture? So that's April 9th at 4:30. And then Sunday, April 27th is our final event for the year. We are hosting a concert with renowned gospel singer J.D. Steele and Ahmed Youssef, a Somali blues artist. And so it's going to be a wonderful event where two different traditions and music styles come together, and we'll learn a lot from that. Thank you all for being here this evening, and one more round of applause for Rabbi Michael Goldberg. Thank you all so much.